normally, you know, I talk about technology and the future and exponentials and possibility, what I call the signals of change, the next 5, 10, 20 years, and I do about 50 talks a year. I speak to lots and lots of people, sometimes 2,000 people in an audience, and it's all well and good, but sometimes I like to be more reflective. I like to go a little deeper back into my own past and also look at today and see what I learned back then and how I can reflect that on how the world is chopping and changing. And I wrote this article, and I put this out onto Medium and also onto my website as well. It's called Breaking Down Personal Dictatorships Creates Progress. And it's really based on the idea that we're in this incredibly diverse world. We live in a world of different people. Races, genders and gender politics, sexual and relationship preferences, political friends and foes, levels of education and expression, and taste in art and food. Ultimately, we're looking for like-minded people to be our colleagues, friends, lovers, partners, and our families. And what's really interesting about this idea is that we all laud the idea of democracy. We spread it around the world. We say that everyone needs to live in a democratic society. However, when democracy truly happens, Brexit happens. The current president of the United States happens. And a lot of us aren't happy because people didn't think the way that we think. Right? But if you think about that, that's a bit of a dangerous sort of trend. Because if you start to only want the people around you to think exactly the way that you think, you're ultimately trying to ask for what could be a liberal dictatorship. So eventually, as you pass through democracy, you get to a point where you do land in a very dangerous position, where you can denounce absolutely everyone. And it might be for good reason in a lot of cases. But if we denounce it and we don't try to engage, then we're not being truly democratic as people. I mean, that's human nature, to look after our own and to find our own people, our tribes. That's tribalism. It's been encoded into how we operate in the world from early beginnings, where we are hunter-gatherers. This is survival. That is dictatorship. Absolute authority in any sphere and across our aspects of our lives. The strongest form of which is what I call personal dictatorships. Our immovable belief systems, our mantras, our self-placed positions in the world. So why do we rely on personal dictatorships? Because conflict is hard. It's not easy to argue, to fight, to be activistic, to stand by your guns and really challenge people's perceptions and listen to them and let them challenge you as well. Discussion in the face of stupidity and opposite opinions is really, really hard. Thinking about this challenge reminds me of my teenage years. Now, I grew up in the southwest of England, quite possibly the whitest place in England I think that you could find. 5,000 people. There was a slaughterhouse in the middle of the village. Every other Thursday they used to empty the blood tanks. My dad used to be a manager at the local slaughterhouse. You don't often hear that today. In fact, the slaughterhouse has now moved out of the village. It's a nice housing estate. I wish they would have called it something like the Slaughterhouse Housing Estate, or Dead Cow Estates, or something like that, or Blood Lane. That would have been lovely. But they didn't. It's called something like Lavers Oak or something beautifully English. But when I grew up there, I was born in 1972. And by the time I was a young teenager, we were right in the grip of Margaret Thatcher, right? Thatcherite Britain, conservatives, the hurrahs in the city were taking cocaine and they were making millions of pounds and everything was good. And meanwhile, we were in a 5,000-person village where people worked in the slaughterhouse, they worked in dairy farms, they worked in glove factories. All these things are pretty much gone today. And part of that is because of what Margaret Thatcher put out into the world. And as you can imagine, the UK was an interesting place in the 80s. There was a lot of burning in streets and suburbs in places like London, Birmingham, Manchester. You know, there was fighting on the streets. Thatcher was trying to break the unions. The unions were trying to break the rich. There was this big phrase, "eat the rich," that happened in the 80s. There's lots of alternative comedies coming out. People were really trying to fight against each other. It was a hugely negative time in the UK. And I actually think that this was born out of societal PTSD. The First World War and the kids that were born to the fathers that fought in those world wars actually became the people that fought in the Second World War, somewhat. And then the PTSD built on top of each other. So by the 1980s, we had a pretty screwed up society. Epigenetically, it all passed down through us, and we were really struggling with how we operated in the world. I mean, I myself had post-traumatic stress disorder for 32 years. It got fixed at the age of 40 when it was found as part of a deep set of counseling sessions I had. It wasn't necessarily caused by my parents' PTSD. However, a little later on, I realized something as I was doing some group therapy last year and some breath work. Both my parents were born at the end of the Second World War. For the first 5 years of their lives, 5-6 years of their lives, which are the most formative years of your life, they were on rations. Their parents were on rations. They had to try and survive. Survival. Talking about money with my mother and father is one of the most difficult things that you can talk about, because they didn't have money, and they still feel that they don't have money. So I've actually gone through a whole bunch of things to break down that thinking. However, let me take you back to the 1980s. I went to this school. 7 different villages went to the same school. It was pretty rough. It was kind of cool, about 1,000 kids. And you know, not everyone got on really well. I was a bit quiet, sort of hidden in the background. I didn't get on with the kids. I didn't smoke behind the bike sheds. I didn't like to get into fights. In fact, I hated fighting. So really, I just sort of withdrew a little bit. But what was really interesting was, by the age of like 14, 15, I sort of found my feet and got friendly with a lot of people. But something quite tragic happened in the following 2 or 3 years. These kids that I grew up with in this village were great. But they had formed themselves into these sort of gangs of kids hanging out. But because of that societal PTSD, maybe their parents weren't around. They certainly weren't good influences. They were being ground into the earth by Thatcherite Britain. Suddenly, some big brothers and new influencers came to these long-lost places in Somerset. The white supremacist National Front members. The cool kids, the skinheads. Hey, ride a scooter, join our scooter gang. Hey, come and meet this guy in a suit that's going to tell you about how, you know, we're your family, we're going to come together. And when I started to think about democracy, I started thinking about this and started thinking about personal dictatorships. And it's like, what happens when 5 of your friends that you grew up with, that you love, suddenly become National Front right-wing skinheads at the age of 15? I spent a lot of time calling them idiots and sitting there and staring people that had literally done jail time, that were their new big brothers, and saying, this is not the way, this is not the right thing to do. And it got tiring. And I withdrew. And I kept going back to remind them of what maybe love looked like in the world and how there's equality in who people are. At the age of 17, 18, I joined the Anti-Nazi League. Right? And I was literally walking around with a t-shirt that said, Nazi punks, fuck off. Right? My grandmother did not like that at Christmas one year on my t-shirt. She was a pretty salty old cat. At the same time, I decided to form punk bands. I was actually really into the American scene. I was into like Fugazi and Big Black. I was really into, you know, some of the sort of the anti-Nazi like movements. Skinheads against racial prejudice. I used to really like fight against this, but I still sat with my friends that were right-wingers, National Front members, and they were just really nice as normal when they were not in the circumstances that they were surrounded by their big brothers and their new uncles and whoever else, right? I never gave up on them, but it was really hard to be around them a lot of the time, so I didn't spend a lot of my time. I was hugely defiant. You know, I'm kind of still defiant, but I'm a lot more approachable these days. If you've ever watched a film, This Is England, it's very indicative of what England was like in the 1980s. If you haven't watched This Is England, go and watch it. It was kids kicking cans around the streets, and suddenly the kids became skinheads. And the kids were trying to get younger kids into it. And it was a very, very dark time in the UK. It would have been really easy to walk away, to dismiss them entirely with my personal dictatorship of liberalism and acceptance as my guide. I did walk away from them. The big thing I realized was walking away and perpetuating our own belief systems is entirely personal dictatorship, and that it's not a positive force in the world. And that's difficult to admit, especially because we do want that kind of world for ourselves. What was really interesting in the 1980s, around about 1989 and 1990, people started to listen to electronic music, like house out of Chicago and techno out of Detroit and the acid house movement. And all these tough kids suddenly started mellowing and started drifting away to go dancing in the fields and taking ecstasy and taking acid, to start coming together. And do you know who was also in those fields? There were black guys, there were Pakistanis, there were Indians, there were white people, there was all sorts of people from all sorts of countries across Europe as well. In fact, ecstasy, LSD, marijuana caused this huge revolution. In the area that I grew up in, there were no black people. The closest were up in Bristol, about 50 miles away. But there were like about 25 different dub sound systems, like serious dub sound systems. The weed and the drugs and these new kind of cultures had seeped back in because people realized that getting together and having an open heart was a better way to be. For a while, the personal dictatorships didn't matter. They went on the back burner. People came together. That time gave birth to new thinking, amazing designers, big thinkers, and new ways of looking at the world. The Gen Xers, right? The activists. Most importantly, it gave birth to the troublemakers in the best possible way. The people that created culture, counterculture, the people that remixed everything and kind of challenged some of the negativity that had gone before. At the age of 18, I voted in Tony Blair, and we're in New Labour, and everything was great, and suddenly you had Oasis drinking beer with Tony Blair in number 10 Downing Street, and everything was cool Britannia, and then about 3 years later, they were exactly the same as the Conservatives. It's a cyclical way of working in British politics. But what's really interesting is that over the past 30 years or so, I've sort of realized that there's a number of guiding lights for an anti-dictatorial world. You know, to sit in the rooms with the people that maybe make us feel uncomfortable. If we can get people onto the same page, we can really, really bind the world together in a much stronger way. And we're in the US, and it's tough. In the UK, it's tough. I don't think I'll ever go back and live in the UK. I live in Canada. We just get mildly upset with Alberta once in a while, and it gets upset with us. And Quebec gets upset with everyone. And then, after a while, we realize that everything's great and we all have some poutine. I make light of Canada, but really Canada is kind of an amazing place. But I think these are the things that we look to, and we have to look to when we step forward in the world and think about an anti-dictatorial way of operating. You cannot refute science and truth. So if you talk about science and truth, people deny it, and you keep talking about it, and you keep pushing it, whether it's climate deniers or anyone else. They're going to be wrong, and they're going to come around and eventually look at science. It's a truth. Rational discussion. Again, difficult to do, but sometimes you have to push a little harder to push through. Empathy through listening and deep understanding. If you do have someone that's got incredibly radical views, and you literally listen to them, and you let them speak and speak and speak, and you don't say a single word, the silence is going to liberate truth in their voices. And when it gets tough, be quiet and listen to them and listen to them and listen to them and come back to them. And this could take weeks, right? But if we don't do it, we end up with more radicalized societies. Then we need to think about diversity. We can surround ourselves by people that are not like us. Right? And I think that's hugely important, both in work and in our social circles. And I think the final thing that I think is important to remind people, and I speak about this in pretty much every one of my talks, whether it's to designers or CFOs, CIOs, CEOs, the people that are changing the world in government, but the belief and support in basic human needs, the need to do good. You know, certainty, variety, significance, connection, love, growth and contribution. We've been having these things as our needs for thousands of years, and they'll be part of our needs for the next few thousand years, certainly. And if we come back to connection and love at the heart of that, it's going to be a really important thing that's going to carry us through. The most important belief, I think, is a belief in determination to stand up and to drive discussion, argument, and persuasion through all of these in the face of people driven by unloving and unaccepting populism, money and their egos. Social media posts just don't cut it. Collectivism is too passive. We can't just share things that we don't like, and it's like, yeah, look at these people across the world. I stand with you. It does nothing. But actually going there and meeting the people, getting on the phone, or really meeting people locally that can help, or really getting involved in those communities. I still reach out and talk to people I disagree with. I start by listening, then I help them open their minds to a wider world. And often I learn things about the world from them. And sometimes it's not good, and sometimes it's very tough to hear some realities that are completely opposite to the reality that I personally want to live in. When I think about personal dictatorship, it's about me sitting down and being very quiet, which has always been very difficult for me. And I think it's difficult for everyone. And I think that we can continue to talk about democracy. We can continue to ultimately live in our own personal dictatorships. But ultimately, I think what's most important to do is ultimately live in a human community where we realize that everyone's a beautiful soul at the center of that. And some people have just got deeper trauma than others. And that we can work through that together if we listen, if we try and understand even the most radical points of view, and we just bring them closer to what can be a better world for everyone together. Thank you very much.